Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and host for the program. Each program we talk about issues that are important for elections and public policy. We hope you'll discuss those same issues, and then at election time you'll be ready and willing to go vote. This program we're going to continue our talk with the legal director for the ACLU of Nebraska, Amy Miller, and we're going to talk about prisons in Nebraska. So welcome back, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Well, one of the campaigns that the ACLU has been working on is the reduction of mass incarceration. And so explain to our viewers, what does that mean?
Unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, America really got addicted to using incarceration as a solution for all of its ills. You've got someone with a drug or alcohol addiction, put them in prison. You've got someone who's mentally ill, put them in prison. Got low-level nonviolent offenders who are writing bad checks or shoplifting, put them in prison. So as a society, America has so many people behind bars that do not need to be there, and Nebraska, as a microcosm of what's happening in our country, is just the same. We have a prison overcrowding problem in Nebraska, and putting lots of people behind bars and convicting people of crimes has all sorts of other societal problems. Taking them away from their families means more kids in foster care and without their parents present. Means more people who are not eligible for housing, education loans, public benefits when they're returned to society, and people who have very difficult time getting jobs because of barriers to people with a former felony or even a misdemeanor conviction. So we've had a culture of mass incarceration, and the suggestion that has been raised at all levels across America is it's probably time to reverse course on that failed social experiment.
Okay. So in general, in our prison system in Nebraska, how many prisons do we have? And most of them are for male prisoners as opposed to female prisoners, I'm assuming.
That's right. There's both the county jails, and that is for people who are pretrial, they can't post bond, they're still presumed innocent, and people who might have been convicted but might be serving a sentence of a year or less. And you have your state prisons, where people who have been convicted of a more serious crime are doing a longer sentence. There's only one facility for women in York, Nebraska. There's a couple camps, work ethic camp, community corrections where people are on work release. But that leaves then all of the facilities are for men, and they range from the maximum security prison in Tecumseh and the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln to your medium security and minimum security at the Omaha Correctional Center. We definitely have the problem that within all of those facilities there's an overrepresentation of people of color, and all of the facilities are creaking at the seams. Our overcrowding ranges from the one facility, the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center in Lincoln, is over 250% capacity, and even our least crowded prison is over 100% capacity. Those just sound like numbers, but when you break it down, that means a cell that was built for 2 men is holding 4 or 5 men in that same cell. And so you squish people into a tiny box for many hours a day, tempers fray, and that is probably one reason why we are seeing an uptick in violence and despair, I think, among individuals who are behind bars right now. And that overcrowding is true at the county level as well as the state level? It is absolutely true at the county level. We spent the summer, in fact, taking a look at our 4 largest counties, trying to ascertain what makes up those county populations. Over half of the folks sitting at the Douglas County, Lancaster County, and Sarpy County jails, they're still innocent people who just can't post bond. If we let those folks go home, put an ankle bracelet, have them call in and do a check-in to make sure that they're going to make their court date, we could free up most of the beds in our county facilities right now. So both at the state and at the county level, we have a need for massive reform that is not rocket science. It just takes a different way of looking at things. We had gotten into the habit of pound everybody with a sentence as big as we can, and that's not working. It's not working economically, and it's not working on the human level for rehabilitation. Okay, and Nebraska is just, within the last year or two, we have a new director of prisons who came from the state of Washington, and he's been trying to make some changes within the system. I think one of the things that he's been hit with that we know of is that staffing is also, besides the overcrowding of prisoners, staffing is an issue with our prisons. We don't have enough staff, we can't fill the positions that there are, and do you want to talk about how that particular issue impacts our prison system? Absolutely. We've had the opportunity to sit and meet face-to-face with the new Department of Corrections Director, Scott Frakes, and we are very impressed with a lot of the reforms he's already brought. He takes very seriously the questions, for example, of solitary confinement, which when he was in Washington State, they managed to almost eliminate the use of solitary. During the same time that Nebraska's prisons were slowly filling way past capacity under his predecessor, Nebraska started using solitary confinement probably as a crowd control technique. If you think about it, having to process lots and lots of inmates from point A to point B just for lunch presents a pretty big security issue, especially when you don't have enough staff. If everybody is locked in their room and has a tray delivered to them, it's very easy for staff, but extremely debilitating psychologically for the people who are subjected to solitary. So we want to give Director Frakes all of the props for taking seriously many of the issues and already starting to talk about the need to reform. The problem is he can pass new rules and new programs and more pep talks, but the issue does come down, unfortunately, as it frequently does, to money. The governor and the legislature need to loosen the strings on the money bag. County officials, folks that take a job as a county corrections officer in the same backyard as the state penitentiary, can be paid more to work for the county. How are we going to attract people to stay or to apply at our state facilities if they could do the same job just down the street for more money? We have to provide more money in order to get those staff positions filled, and that's something that is beyond Director Frakes' control. We do applaud him for many of the steps he's taken, but this is going to need more than just one man with all of his vision to reverse course. And the legislature has been talking about and sort of starting to take a serious look at the need for more appropriations. But we keep hearing disturbing suggestions about maybe we could spend the money on building a new prison. We don't need more bricks and mortar. We need more of the people who didn't need to be behind bars to begin with, back at home with their families, being contributing members of society.
Okay. And one of the, well, you talked about the need for more money to pay staff, and one of the issues too then is that you have slots that aren't filled for employees, but high turnover, and then you're losing veteran staff members who have been there for very long. So how does that impact our prison system? Do we need more training for staff then?
It really has, unfortunately, become a problem of the snake with its tail in its mouth. We weren't paying enough money. The prisons got overcrowded. They became much less pleasant places to work at because as you put more people behind the solitary confinement walls, all of the mental health experts agree, if you weren't mentally ill to begin with, being placed in solitary for even 30 days could make you go insane. And the problem is, under his predecessor, the Department of Corrections were putting men in solitary confinement for 5, 10, 15 years. As the work environment becomes less pleasant and the inmates who are jammed into tiny cells, even those not in solitary confinement, are breaking out into more fights, they're angrier, they're less pleasant to deal with, staff have been driven away and they're choosing to work elsewhere. If not in county corrections, they're just leaving the facilities entirely. Last I heard, we had over 40 mental health positions that were currently open and unfilled for the State Department of Corrections. Now, that's particularly worrisome because of the high incidence of mental illness for people who are behind bars. Different statistics suggest somewhere between 75 to 95% of prison inmates do have a current mental health diagnosis. That might be situational, depression related to being currently incarcerated, but that can be more serious conditions, being bipolar or schizophrenic. We need qualified, trained professionals, both on the mental health side, the medical side, people to do programming to rehabilitate folks so that they can come back to society with some skills and some coping mechanisms. But the downward spiral of more people leave, the situation gets worse, more people leave, fewer people apply. This is why we're suggesting that a financial solution of offering very generous salaries that will attract and hopefully then get people to stick, that should start to arrest some of the really horrific hemorrhaging we're seeing both with staff and with conditions within the prison.
So we should be looking for senators in the unicameral this next session to be dealing with this.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We need a sort of holistic solution. Not only do we need to deal with the crisis that currently presents itself, We've got to stop shoveling people into this furnace that is our current prison system. The legislature in the last 2 sessions has started to really look at front-end reforms, scaling back sentences, for example. Do we need a shoplifter to spend time behind bars, or do we need that person to be on intensive probation where they're checking in with a probation officer, paying back their debt to society? But do we need to take her away from her family and lock her up for 10 years? A large chunk of the Nebraska prison population, at least a third, are nonviolent offenders. They're people with drug or alcohol-related crimes, property-related crimes. Just taking the nonviolent offenders alone and putting them back at home with supervision would immediately start to address these issues. But we have to stop sentencing people to the maximum that we can just to prove to them that we're angry about the crime they did. So we need our senators, and as you are trying to choose who you're going to vote for, we hope that you would look at whether the candidate has got some positions on both front end and back end prison reform.
Okay. And pretty much there, we're talking about reforming or dealing differently with, depending on the level of the crime. That answers the question of, do we need to build more prisons, or at least people should weave that into the analysis of whether we need more prisons, that we could take care of the overcrowding by just changing some of the requirements for people to be put into prison.
It would be a relatively simple fix to start looking, especially the low-hanging fruit would be your nonviolent offenders, and also the very short sentences. The Nebraska legislature brought in CSG, the Council of State Governments, a nonpartisan organization that does strategic planning and recommendations for states across the country. And they pointed out that Nebraska keeps sentencing people to the maximum, but they sometimes are relatively short sentences, like they might only do 18 months. So there's never an opportunity for the person to truly get job skills or some type of mental health stability. All that happens is we really destabilize their life by putting them behind bars, and then also destabilize their families. So the legislature has already had some recommendations about looking at the very easiest of crimes. And I always need to remind people, when you look at the folks who are behind bars, I think there can be this sort of, well, they did the crime, let them do the time. They may be sort of disposable because of their choices. The majority of people sitting behind bars are not murderers and rapists who are going to be there for life. The average sentence in our State Department of Corrections is 22 months. So from a purely self-interested perspective of these folks are coming back to be our neighbors, to be our family members, to be our coworkers, we can't have a system that has the bulk of people coming back more damaged, more strained from their experience behind bars. It's something we need to do both for their sake and for our sake.
So you're really saying that we've been focused so much on the punishment aspect that we've not looked at restoring them to being a productive member of society and giving them the help they need.
Absolutely.
Okay. One issue that I wondered is, has it come up at all in talk, and is privatization. And I know that on the federal level, we've just said, we're not doing that anymore, it doesn't work. So has there been any talk about doing that on the state level to take care of our prison problem?
This would be one of the good news spots for Nebraska. Nebraska does not have any private prisons, and so far I've not heard any rumbles about privatizing. In other states that have tried that experiment, it has turned into a human tragedy very quickly. A for-profit corporation, of course, when they get a note from a prisoner saying that they're not feeling well and would like to see the doctor, the private corporation is thinking, well, that costs money. Let's deny the request. And then it blossoms into full-blown pneumonia or untreated cancer. The private prison industry across the country has been quite a scandal, and we are very lucky that Nebraska has a state agency that is running its work through the public sphere. And although we have our criticisms of how it's been handled, at least it is purely accountable to the public with open records requests and legislative committees. So that is something that we can be proud of, and hopefully will stay our norm.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about race and income and how it affects who goes to prison, and then of course affects our overcrowding and the problems with our prison system.
It is unfortunately the same bad story that you might expect if you have done any reading in the question of how police interaction, how the criminal court system, how judges sentencing, and the problem really becomes a sandwich of all of those. Is it because police are mostly pulling over drivers of color, who then that's who they catch with drugs in the car, who then get sentenced more harshly by a judge with an implicit bias? There are so many places in the system where this might be the explanation for why we have overrepresentation of minorities. But when you look at the numbers, they're jaw-dropping. Nebraska is still mostly a white state. I think the last census suggested we were 10 or 11% people of color if you added all of the biracial, multiracial, and people of color together. But behind bars right now, it is 40% people of color in our state facilities. Now, believe me, it is not just people of color who are committing crimes, but those are the folks who disproportionately are bearing the burden of our war on drugs and our harsh sentencing schemes. And when you think about those other collateral consequences, say that you do get a drug arrest and you do spend time in prison and your kids do end up in foster care, and then you do your time and you come out and you get your kids back, but you try to get a job. You're not eligible for public housing because of your conviction, and no employer will look at you because of your conviction. It's not surprising that you then see a spiral, not just for that individual, but for whole communities of poor people and people of color in our state. We absolutely need to take a look at this because it is affecting those among us who already had the least that was available to give up.
Okay. And when you talked about the mental health needs, and obviously if there are 40 open positions and so many, the high percentage of people have a mental health issue, we're not treating people and giving them the help that they need. Another issue is, I think, Medicaid coverage. When someone comes out of prison, do they get back on Medicaid right away, and can they get the help or medications that they might need? How is that affected?
All of those issues, re-entry into the community, getting applications for benefits again, is something that we'd like to see have the department work on. As I understand it, it still is currently the policy. When you are released from prison, you get back the property you were arrested with, you get a bus travel either to Omaha or Lincoln, whichever is your destination, and a hearty wave goodbye. There is no planning to find some place for you to live. Now, if you're going to be paroled, there certainly is a better structure for that. But for people who are released, there is not enough reentry programming. And we understand there's more in progress now under Director Frakes. But there should be a social worker who sits down months ahead of time and says, we're going to need to apply to get you Medicaid benefits back. We need to make sure we get you a bus pass. Are you going to live in Omaha or Lincoln? Let's make sure we get you qualified for that. To work through those issues and make sure that we connect people to social services within their community. Otherwise, we're setting them up to just fail again if they don't have someone on the outside, family, friends, or faith community waiting to pick them up and kind of give them a little boost for those first crucial months after they're released.
Okay, and that leads right into asking about what is our recidivism rate? How do we compare to other states, and how many people who are in prison incarcerated end up back there because we don't give them enough assistance to make it?
The statistics are a little hard to grab right now because, unfortunately, the Department of Corrections used to publish a monthly data sheet on their website. It had the breakdown of people's crimes, race, gender. It had a lot of robust information. And the Department of Corrections has not been, and its recidivism rates, the department hasn't had that information up since spring of 2015. They're not providing those numbers anymore. But I can tell you, as of over a year ago, the recidivism rate for Nebraska was roughly in line with our sister states. And I believe it was maybe a third of folks. So it could be better. But actually, a lot of people, whatever wobble it was that put them behind bars, a poor choice, an addiction, gang involvement, whatever the wobble was, the majority of people don't wobble after that. They figure it out, they hit the ground running, and they come back to our community as restored citizens. It's that smaller group that does have just a second wobble, a third wobble, a fourth wobble, that we need to figure out how can we make sure that we're providing programs and rehabilitation behind bars for the public service of making sure that the public is not subjected to whatever their crime was again and again and again.
Okay. And what can we learn from other states? What are some good best practices that we could take and apply? I'm sure that hopefully the unicameral senators and prison director is looking at what particular things other states have done well, not done well, that we could learn from and use in Nebraska.
We think right now the number one piece that has not passed in Nebraska that needs to is looking at those lower level sentences for folks and making sure that instead of using incarceration, that intensive probation to make sure that they stay in the communities, stay in their jobs, stay with their families. We still are taking relatively non-serious crimes, shoplifting, kiting bad checks, DUI, possession of drugs, and putting those people behind bars, and that is slowing down the process for everybody. The prison is there to house people that are currently violent or dangerous to other people, and to really get hold of folks that need a serious turnaround. So we have got to look at changing those minimum sentences and giving judges a lower range and more flexibility theoretically to keep the folks in their communities. We also probably need more reform on the solitary confinement side. We passed some reforms. There's now reporting happening, and so we're starting to see the first reports coming out of how many people are in solitary confinement, how long they've been there, and why. It's probably necessary because we still have, I think the most recent report suggested almost a third of those folks had a serious mental health diagnosis.
Okay.
Those are exactly the people who should not be in solitary confinement.
Just making it worse.
So we may need a bright line rule forbidding the use if the state's senators were willing to go that direction.
Okay. Have there been any court cases on a state or the federal level involving solitary confinement?
There have, and usually after a very serious tragedy, like someone committing suicide in solitary confinement. The other court cases that we've seen that we have cited to the Nebraska legislature would include what happened, for example, in California. California had overcrowding levels about the same as Nebraska currently has, and it took 14 years of court battles, but ultimately the federal courts ordered the prisons that they had to get the overcrowding under control, even if that meant an immediate release on parole, all of the nonviolent prisoners that they had. Now, we don't think a federal judge needs to tell Nebraska, get constitutional and get humane. And that, of course, is the hallmark, right? The Eighth Amendment says no cruel or unusual punishment. And I can't think of anything more cruel than taking someone who is a nonviolent offender, smushing them into a cell that has twice the number of people that are supposed to be in it, offer them no rehabilitation in a violent setting where folks who have untreated mental health illness are fighting or attacking folks in the hallways, and then releasing them onto the street and saying, good luck. We've got to fix this problem because it's the right thing to do. It will save taxpayer money, and it will save us from a potential class action lawsuit.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about, and when you're talking about saving money, and if the death penalty remains abolished after the vote this November in Nebraska, that means we wouldn't have a need for a death row anymore. So how would that affect what's going on in our prison system?
You know, having a death penalty is so hugely expensive from every point on the timeline of a death penalty case. We do maintain a separate death row unit. Inmates who are condemned to die are put separate from other inmates, I guess with the idea that they are so awful that they can't even have contact with other serious offenders. Having a separate unit means just serving lunch means that a separate guard has to take care of all the lunch duties. Having exercise time means a separate guard has to take care of that. It's so labor intensive that having no death row will help. Having fewer nonviolent offenders will help. Having more people receiving rehabilitation and mental health care so that their behavior is less extreme, all of these things will help. But abolishing the death penalty should free up both state and county resources that can be better redirected to take care of people instead of trying to kill people.
Okay. And so this next session, unicameral, what should citizens expect of their senators? And what's the ACLU's approach? What are you working on or looking forward to doing within this next session?
We definitely want to raise up both this question of sentencing reform so that we don't just resort to putting people behind bars for everything. You're likely to also see, at least we'll be hoping to see, some senators responding to our call about the county jail issue as well. When people are in county jail simply because they can't post bond, we think that violates the Constitution. If someone is a danger pre-trial, they may be presumed innocent, but it is appropriate to hold someone who is currently a physical threat or someone who's Bernie Madoff and has the resources to flee to another jurisdiction. But if over half of our county inmates are just sitting there because they can't post $100, $500, $1,000 bond on a nonviolent crime, that is county taxpayer money down the drain for people who thus far are still innocent. So we'd like to see some issues at the legislature, both maybe on bond reform and on these minimum sentences to address our state prison issues.
Okay. And is there support from counties in terms of advocating for the reforms? Because of course that means less pressure on county jails, less money to run county jails, or maybe expand the need for beds in them. So are you getting support from counties on this issue?
I think it's going to be interesting to see. We have a report that should be out shortly before Thanksgiving on this issue as a result of our study over the summer. It's not gone public yet, but we are hoping that county boards, county supervisors will take a quick look at that and say, what an easy way to solve some of our budget issues. If you were to pull the Douglas County budget right now, you will see one humongous budget line, and that's Department of Corrections. It is far outsources everything else on the county budget. So if you could have that problem, we would hope that the fiscal conservatives would take a look at that and say, that seems fiscally prudent to reassess how we are handling folks. And to be fair, the County Department of Corrections are not at fault here. This is a court system problem where judges and prosecutors have people sitting waiting on bonds. So the Department of Corrections at the county level is not to blame, but they're bearing the brunt of it.
Okay. So if I'm a concerned citizen, I want to talk to my legislator, my senator, I should be asking the senator to take a look at that report when it comes out.
Absolutely. And you'll be able to find it both on our website, www.aclunebraska.org. We're on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and you can follow us. There's also a lot of information about all these issues at the parent organization, the National ACLU's organization. That website is just aclu.org. And you are welcome both to contact us with questions, or if you have a loved one behind bars who's experiencing these problems, we welcome you to reach out to us and see if we can help.
Thanks so much, Amy. Appreciate you being here and talking about this issue for Nebraskans. So,
Thank you.
For the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, and at election time, go vote, Omaha.